Hi, my name is Allan Friedman. I'm very excited to talk to you today. And I'm excited to talk to you today for a few reasons. First, I'm sorry that we can't have a fun event in Pittsburgh. I'm actually a Yinzer, born and raised. I was born in McEwen's Hospital. I'm a product of the Pittsburgh public school system, go Alterdice Dragons. But I'm also really excited for two other reasons. First, just to go back to the slideshow. This is one of my favorite graphics to use. I've given this talk once before, 2 years ago at Black Hat with the same title, but at the time I call it How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the SBOM. Over 2 years, we as a community have made a lot of progress in thinking about software transparency. So that's why I'm calling the talk How We Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the SBOM. And hopefully by the end of it, you'll be excited enough that you'll want to start asking for it and maybe even get involved. So let's dive in, and I'm going to ask a sort of motivational question here, which is how many of you are in organizations that, whether you make software or whether you just use software, can quickly and easily answer the following question of, hey, there's a new vulnerability, it's all over Twitter, it's even on the news. Your boss calls and she asks, are we affected? And I'd put it to you that surprisingly few organizations can quickly and easily answer that question, especially when it's a low-lying open source component rather than, a big piece of classic enterprise software. And to me, that's kind of crazy. The hard work should be in finding the vulnerabilities, discovering them in the first place, not finding out whether they're on our networks. And that's really what SBOM is about. So what are we going to be talking about over the next 18 minutes? I'm going to, challenge of virtual events is I have to literally be more interesting than the entire internet. We're going to talk about transparency and just how it relates to supply chains in general. We're going to talk about SBOM. I'm going to briefly try to help you understand this is such a good idea, why we aren't doing this already. Then I'm going to talk about what we as a community have done in this international cross-sector approach. Talking about the what of what is an SBOM, why is an SBOM, and then of course, how do we do this? And then ideally, pitch you to get involved yourself. And this is, SBOM, ask for it by name. So we're all pretty familiar with the idea of a list of ingredients. Now, this is the list of ingredients for a Twinkie. And maybe you like Twinkies, maybe you don't, but sometimes you care about what's inside them. And it turns out that Twinkies are not vegetarian. Now, maybe you don't care, but we all know someone who has a dietary restriction or food sensitivity, and they'll want that information in an easy and accessible format. And to me, it's kind of crazy that we have this information from the world's least biodegradable snack, but we don't have it for the software that we all depend on a daily basis. And it's not just, in Twinkies. This is, a fancy plane that we spent a lot of money on to develop in the United States. That plane has buried deep in it a certain operating system, a real-time operating system. That real-time operating system, in turn, has a vulnerability. How do we make sure that the people who are managing these critical systems can find out what's buried deep inside? You can't defend what you don't know about. So what's the software equivalent of this list of ingredients? I'd put it to you that it is this idea of a software bill of materials. Forgive the wall of text here. We try to minimize them on our slides, but it's important to sort of say this is what the definition is. And here are 3 different definitions. It's a formal record of the supply chain relationships in software. It's a nested inventory. Here are the ingredients that we have. And it lists those in components and the relationships between them. Now, SBOM fits into a lot of different areas of security that we all care about. And you can think of this as a spectrum from the people who make software. You're interested in secure development processes, SDLCs. You're probably focused on your supply chain if you're a mature organization. People who are choosing software, who are selecting things for their organization, whether they're buying them or using open source components. They're interested in supply chain. They're also interested in risk management And this is where we get into our third-party risk management approach. And of course, those of us who operate software, and by the way, this is everyone, we need to have a vulnerability management approach. SBOM doesn't solve these, but it helps each of these roles in a critical fashion. And I'll try to walk through that. But I want you to appreciate that this is something that really is important on everything from the application developer to the OT implementer, all the way down to just your standard blue team vulnerability management approach. SBOM is really going to help across the board. So Allan, if it's so useful, why aren't we doing this already? Well, first, it's important to acknowledge that some people already tried. Now, I don't want to get too much into the weeds in the history of politics, but 6 or 7 years ago, there was actually a bill in Congress that would have required everything a certain part of the US government bought to have an SBOM. And to be frank, the IT industry nuked it from orbit. And we can, you can find me sometime and ask me a little privately about some of the politics behind that. But I think there were some reasons why. First is open source, right? I don't know, even until quite recently, how many organizations could honestly say that they had all their software licenses in order. I'd put it to you today that it's a much better understood risk. That's something that there are now commercial off-the-shelf tools for. There are projects like the Linux Foundation's Open Chain to help companies better manage their open source licenses. If you have a startup, you know that you're going to go through an open source audit on exit. So I think we understand that risk better. But we also have to acknowledge that this is hard. If it were easy, we'd already be doing it. And we probably shouldn't put things in regulation until we know how to do things. What I'd put it to you is this is actually a little bit of a chicken and egg problem, where on one hand, no one's asking for it, so no one's supplying it. And on the other, no one's supplying it, so no one's asking for it. And that is what those of us who have some economics training call a market failure. Now, a market failure is fun for a couple of reasons. First of all, you get some interesting math if you like the economics of it, but also it's a role for the government to come in. We're from the government and we're here to help you. So there are a couple of ways that government traditionally solves problems. We can either force you to do something through regulation, and Congress in their wisdom didn't see fit to empower yours truly to force anyone to do anything. And we can also reward you. We can give you certain kinds of incentives, or we can pay you. And unfortunately, no one gave me a budget, so I can't personally pay you to do anything. So what is our solution? Our solution is to try to bring the entire community together, to bring both the chicken and the egg together and say, how can we make this work? What's a good solution? So here's your basic process slide. And if you've never seen one of these, congratulations, you've managed to avoid politics. Well done. The vision here is to create a very broad approach. We wanted to make sure, first and foremost, that we were avoiding sector-specific solutions. So what we really didn't want is to say, this is the healthcare way of doing things, and this is the military way of doing things, and this is how just the standard enterprise IT world does things. Because now we have a fragmented ecosystem. And guess what? We all use the same software. So we have to have a solution that works across all of these sectors, even though there are very different ways that software is made and used, whether it's in the automotive sector or banks. Similarly, we needed to capture not just the entire cross-sector approach, but the entire supply chain. We wanted to make sure that this is something that included the open source perspective, the commercial software perspective, those who deal with embedded software, IoT or OT, and of course, perhaps most importantly, the customers, the people who are using this stuff. We need to have them at the table. So this is a very broad approach. We're trying to get every sector, the entire supply chain. That's why we framed it very specifically to only look at the set of software dependencies. Now, the way we've done this is in an open, transparent, multi-stakeholder process. If you kind of roll your eyes at hearing the term multi-stakeholder process, I'm the guy who has to say it like 20 times a day, so have a little sympathy, okay? Don't be so smug. What we're not doing, so I also want to be clear about this. I mentioned this is not about regulation. We're not a regulator. This is not source code disclosure. That's something that I often have to be very careful of when I talk about lobbyists, especially on the international stage. This is not a formal standards development process. In fact, I'm going to talk about how there are already standards out there doing this. And perhaps most importantly, we're not trying to solve all of the issues around software supply chain and software assurance. I'm sure you're working on some issues that are really important. You're providing solutions for your problems. That's wonderful. What we want to do is take this SBOM layer, right? It's very broad. We're trying to keep it as narrow as possible to help it slot in to however you're working on security. So we've been doing this for 2 years now, and I'm pretty happy with the progress we've made, because what we've done is we've managed to bring together all of these different sectors from around the world and to create a shared vision of what is an SBOM. We didn't have that before. And not only that, but to focus on some aspects. It's got to be machine readable so it can scale, and it's got to be modular so it can dock with all these other efforts. And we want to follow a crawl, walk, run model. We don't want to try to solve everything all at once. We're not trying to build something gorgeous in a cathedral and then bring it out to the world. Our focus is to coin a completely original phrase, rough consensus and running code. So as I mentioned, I'm going to walk through what an SBOM is, why we should do it, and then how we can do it. And then I'm going to talk about what the path to deployment is. So first, Allan, you've been talking about an SBOM for a while. You threw up a wall of text. What the heck's an SBOM, other than something that you shouldn't say a lot back when you were traveling in airports? So an SBOM is really just a dependency graph. If you follow the math, it's a directed acyclic graph. Here's a toy example where we have our Acme appliance, and the Acme appliance in turn depends on Bingo Buffer and Bob's browser. Bob's browser in turn depends on Carol's compression engine. That's all it is, with one other key layer of data, which is we try to be explicit about known unknowns. So for example, in this graph, we know that Acme appliance has exactly 2 direct dependencies, Bingo Buffer and Bob's browser. We have no idea what's in Bingo Buffer. We know that Carol's compression engine is a root of our tree, or a leaf, depending on which way you talk about your trees, which is to say it has no further dependencies. And in this case, we know that Bob's browser at least contains Carol's compression engine, but we have no idea whether it contains further things. Now, those details allow us to focus it, and I'll talk about that in a moment. For each of these components, we don't need that much data. The goal here is to say, who's the supplier? What's the component name? What version is it? So that I know if there's a vulnerability, I know if it's up to date. And by the way, what's the hash? So that I know that you and I are talking about the same component. And we may want to make sure, for example, that the version that I'm talking about isn't something that I just downloaded off of a backdoor GitHub repo or a pirate GitHub repo or a typo squatted GitHub repo. There are lots of, right, this is about putting some assurance in the supply chain. So in our graph, how do we want to go? Ideally, I'd love to go as deep as possible. The minimum you can have is you need to have all of your top level includes. Each of those should in turn ask for their includes. And ideally, we'll make a best faith effort for all known components, right? The vision here is to use the power of recursion. This is one of those areas where we don't want to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. There are going to be some folks who will start asking for a complete SBOM, the full graph, but we wanted to make sure that we weren't requiring that at the beginning. After all, any information is better than no information. So that's the basics. There's some more information on this website that I keep popping up, ntia.gov/SBOM. But Allan, you've talked a little bit about the vulnerability management case. Why should we do this? So it depends on what role you occupy in the ecosystem. So for example, if you produce software, here's some benefits. If you choose software, if you operate software, there can be different values. I'm not going to walk through all of these, but I want to flag some things. First of all, this really helps if you're building software, right? You can't really claim to have a secure development process if you're not tracking the components, right? How else are you going to enable allow lists or deny lists? And moreover, there's value to your customers. You're a potential customer. First thing you want to know is, am I about to buy something that's broken out of the box? But it also allows you to do things like compliance with policies, thinking about end of life or orphan components, or identifying, hey, this is really dependent on this single open source project that only has one maintainer. So now you can ask the vendor, hey, if this maintainer gets hit by a bus, what happens to the future of your product? These are questions that you simply can't ask if you can't visualize, if you don't have information into the supply chain of that. And of course, licensing is an important issue. And lastly, for operating software, I talked about the value of needing to find vulnerabilities, but there's also the importance of administration. Folks are starting to implement this into their asset management, their SIEM products. And perhaps most importantly, when you find out a potential vulnerability, right now, without an SBOM, the only way you know about it is if you get the patch. That you may have to wait a little bit for the patch. Independent mitigations are really valuable here. So let's take a look at remediation with and without SBOM. At the top of this graph, we find our vulnerability way upstream in a part of this piece of software, and it now has to percolate downstream. I find the vulnerability, I build the patch, I send it downstream to the compound part, who sends it downstream to the final good, which in turn then has to send it down to the operator who has to patch. At the bottom of this chart, we have a different world where there is, everyone knows about it as soon as the vulnerability is discovered. And so even though the patch doesn't magically appear, SBOMs, alas, don't solve that. What they do is allow people to make a certain decision. When I know that there's a potential vulnerability, I can say, well, if I don't have a patch, even if I don't want to yank it off, I can segment my network. I can tune my IBS. I can ask my threat intel company to keep an eye out for any type of exploit in the wild. Because as soon as I have that, then I can take this other risk-based information. The other value here is it really is going to be able to push natural selection up the software ecosystem. So we got the what, we got the why. How do we do it, Alan? Well, we did not want to be a standards development process. The good news is that there's at least one standard out there that can do it. The slightly less good news is there are multiple standards, but that's okay. We've got SPDX, which comes Linux Foundation. There's SWID tags, which is an ISO standard. Who doesn't love an ISO standard? And there's a newer standard that comes out of the OWASP world called Cyclone DX. All of these are being used today. Our vision here isn't to say this standard wins. It's not the government's job. We don't think that that's what anyone should be doing. The vision here is to identify what are the common elements and to focus on translation so that we can have maximum interoperability. And that's what we've managed to do so far. Those core fields that I talked about before, here's how you can reference them in each of these three standards. So now we're collecting tools that are already available to help you make your SBOM and use your SBOM today. And then finally, I want to briefly touch on some work that's happening because we didn't just want to say, let's put this idea out there. We wanted to show that it could work. And the healthcare community, in fact, the community that focuses on medical devices, has really come forward and said, we want to show that this is possible. And so over 2019, they did a first proof of concept. In 2020, they've done a second, much more sophisticated proof of concept. In the middle of the world's most critical public health crisis, we have the best hospitals in America partnering with some of the most sophisticated medical suppliers in the country to generate SBOMs, share them, and use them against predefined security use cases. That's how important this issue is for the community. So what are we working on now? We want to refine and extend the model. We're tackling things like how to share SBOM data, thinking about cloud. We're focusing on tooling to make sure that we can do this today. What tools exist and what tools do we need? We have a whole working group focusing on awareness and adoption. How do we get this out to the community? What does draft contract language look like? So you can ask for SBOM by name. And further demonstrations in other sectors. We're talking to folks in energy. We're talking to folks in finance. We're talking to the broader health IT sector. And we're focusing on playbooks and how-to guides. We're also tackling a fun little challenge, which is, hey, not all vulnerables are critical. How do we think about vulnerability versus exploitability? But to sum up, transparency is a big issue that we need. Right? It's not going to solve all of our problems in security, but a lot of what we need to do is, this entire SBOM is part of this complete breakfast. A lot of what we need to do starts with transparency. So to recap here, tracking third-party components is critical for a range of risks in the ecosystem. Right? You can think of this as the next step. Asset management is number one on all of our security lists. This is the next step down there. The solution for getting deeper into the supply chain is going to have to be cross-sector. It's going to have to be international. And that's what we've done. We've pulled together this community, focusing on what it is, why it is, and how to implement it. Sectors and organizations can shape their own future through a proof of concept exercise. So if you're interested in this, please don't hesitate to get in touch. Happy to talk about how you can ask for this from your suppliers, how you can offer it to your customers, and ideally, how you can get involved in the conversation. Website is ntia.gov/SBOM. You'll find all the information you need to know. Don't hesitate to reach out. I'm happy to set up a briefing for you and your team. And if you really like and you ever send me a note that you saw this talk and you liked it, let me know and I will give you this handy dandy SBOM sticker that we have. We might even make some more. And of course, reach out on Twitter, #SBOM to join the conversation. So thanks so much and looking forward to your questions and hopefully you'll stay in touch and we can chat.